The Master Tavern Keeper's History of the Old World. So, everyone, as a nearly middle-aged mariner...
Och, are you sure that's not supposed to be an ancient mariner?
Oi! It's the distance travelled, not the years, that have given me this rough, worn yet manly frame. I actually suspect that I'm younger than you, Master Alchemist.
Och, yar, I can guarantee that. Oh, yeah, and so how many summers have you seen, Master Alchemist?
Far too many. Far more than I can count.
And, well, all I'll say is that my looks definitely belie my true age in actual years. Let's leave it at that, eh?
Aye, that is pretty wise. Anyway, as I was about to say, as a nearly middle-aged mariner, I love to talk ships and boats, and so I think it is time that we discuss the boats of the fleet of the dwarf hold of Barak Varr. Past, present, and future.
Future? What do you mean? How can you do that?
Well, that particular pool of knowledge comes courtesy of my uncle's friend Hans Voigt, but more on that in due course. Let us begin, as is right and proper, in the distant past. The fleet of Barak Varr. Not long after the founding of the hold of Barak Varr, the dwarves there, well, to put no finer point on it, the engineers of the Cragbrow clan, started to make, or perhaps experiment in the craft of making, is a more accurate way of describing it, boats. The reason that the dwarves of Barak Varr engaged in this less than typical dwarven pursuit was that they required some way of navigating the rivers of the old world in order to send and receive goods to and from the other holds. As we mentioned earlier, Barak Varr is a dwarf hold apart from the rest of Kara's Anchor, and thus its connections to the other holds in the World's Edge Mountains were of paramount importance, and needed to be maintained by whatever means possible. The very earliest boats were simple affairs, not unlike the present-day vessels of the Norse, although sailless. They were vessels that relied on oar and brawn for their propulsion. These initial forays into boat building used sweeps of oars along the two flanks of the vessel to power them along, each manned by a burly dwarf. However, these were soon improved upon, through the use of gears, cogs, and whatnot, to increase the efficacy of the process, quickly leading to a reduction in the number of dwarves needed to man each vessel, thus creating more room for more precious and lucrative cargo. These early ancient vessels were known as Grubarks. The Grubark was a very successful design, and the number needed by the hold grew and grew. Out of the necessity of requiring somewhere to moor these river boats, the first quays, which then quickly developed into a whole harbour, grew up, right where the dwarf hold met the waters of the Black Gulf. The years rolled on in this way, and the harbour was developed, redesigned, and refined. As a result, it came to attract trade and traders from other sources beyond the realm of the dwarves, and perhaps the most important and influential of these were the elves, specifically those that had begun to colonize the old world. At this time, during the early years of contact with the elves, the Grubark was still the mainstay of the dwarves' waterborne trading network. Up until that time, Each boat had been responsible for hauling large quantities of goods to and from the dwarf holds to the east. But as trade with the new elf cities and colonies that had sprung up to the west of the hold of Barak Varr became more and more important, many newly built grubaks found themselves exclusively travelling in the opposite direction to trade with the Elgi. They used the rivers initially, but as the trade between the two races flourished, the elves began to travel to Barak Varr directly by sea, along the coast and up the Gulf. This made an impression on the dwarves of the hold, and they began to look closely at the elven ships moored in their new harbour, taking great inspiration from what they saw. Innovation began with the Grubak riverboats themselves. Firstly, trying to make these quicker, stabler, and more buoyant, slowly changing materials out to increase the cargo capacity of each, with thick, heavy timber being replaced by metal in certain portions of the boat. Now, at this particular juncture, before I go any further, I just want to say that it is worth noting that the Norse dwarves, particularly those of the hold of Kraka Ravensvik, the first of the northern Norscan holds to make themselves a navy for both war and trade, still favour the refined Grubak design from this period, which surely demonstrates the solidity of ancient dwarf design, even when it has been superseded by innovation. But more on the Norse dwarves later, when we get back to Strolvar's story. Anyway, whilst some engineers were renovating their existing vessels, other dwarves in old Barak Varr started creating new seaworthy boats inspired by the ocean-going vessels of the elves. However, they did not simply copy the Elgi designs. Rather, the dwarves' natural antipathy towards wave and water, wind and sail meant that they approached the entire endeavour in a wholly different way, eschewing many more traditional shipbuilding ideas in favour of more novel designs that built upon what they had already achieved.
Oh, so what did they come up with then?
Well, the most well-known fruit of their labours is the Gazan Harbark, a boat that uses rotary sails rather than canvas to utilise the winds of the sea to power the boat. And this has remained the mainstay of the dwarf fleets up until the present day, now in the 16th century. The Gazan Harbarks still have sweeps of oars, but use the power of their rotary sails to operate the oars of the ship, meaning even less dwarf crew were needed to operate their boats. The design of the vessel was also adapted to become the primary dwarf warship during the War of Vengeance, and they still form the majority of the Army of the Sea, as the dwarves of Barak Varr call their navy. At the same time, the engineers of Barak Varr also managed to create mechanical engines in lieu of sails that could drive rotating paddles on the side of the boats instead of oars. However, it was found that the size of these engines kept them from being used for cargo ships, with space being at a premium on such vessels. And although it is arguably the better, more dependable and efficient design, it has thus far been relegated for use only on specialist vessels. However, that all might be about to change, as plans are already well underway to replace the Gazan Harbark.
Oh, yeah. What do you mean, Master Tavern Keeper?
Well, please cast your minds back to our little discussion of the boats of the Chaos Dwarves. The Frundar Mordian Slagfist was quite disparaging of the dwarf fleet of Barak Varr, if you recall, and he is probably not wrong to do so. Compared to the fleet of the Dawizar, it is archaic and primitive. However, all that is about to change, for the navy of Barak Varr is on the cusp of a revolution. Plans, decades, maybe even centuries in the making, are getting closer and closer to coming to fruition. And once more, it is members of the engineering clan, the Cragbrows of Barak Varr, who hold the keys to the future. But this is the dwarves we are talking about, so it could well be yet further decades, or even more likely centuries away from actually happening. Who knows? Oh, yeah, this is true, Master Tavern Keeper, but what plans are you referring to? And how did you come by this knowledge? Ah, very astute questions, my most noble knight. And questions I will be most happy to answer.